Alrighty then, we'll start the webinar now. Good afternoon, everyone. Hope this finds you well, wherever you are. My name is Mudigdo, the Senior Wealth Advisor here in Oreana Private Wealth. Thank you for joining us to go through the Australian Federal Budget 23-24, key strategies and considerations for Australian expats. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to our members of our various Australian community groups here in Hong Kong as well that has joined us today, such as the Australian Chamber of Commerce, the Hong Kong Dragons, Oz Hong Kong, and the Sandy Bay Rugby Club. Welcome, and everyone else that has joined in. We're proud to be engaged and linked with these community groups who have done a great job in making it easier for us to have Hong Kong as a home away from home, if you like. So thank you for joining with us. A special shout out to the Hong Kong Dragons who will play out their final round this weekend at Sai Kung. Hope you get to enjoy the weekend and come home safely. Matt and I will be there in spirit. So what I'd like to do today really is to go through some of the a summary, if you like, of the Australian federal budget, especially from the lens of being overseas or as expats, and see if there's any tidbits that came out of that would be of relevance to us. I'll also take the opportunity to go through some key strategies, just a reminder, if you like, or a refresher of some of the things that you can actually consider when you are looking at your own financial position, if you like, both either here or in Australia. Before I do just a few housekeeping rules. The webinar will go for about 30-35 minutes. Everyone will be muted during the webinar. There'll be a Q&A button there on the bottom dashboard if you would like to use that to ask any questions that I'll attend to at the end of the webinar. Now we'll also be sending a copy of the webinar to you, so you can actually go through it, and if need be, please feel free to reach out to us here in Oreana if you do have any questions or anything we can help you with in that respect. In terms of, I guess, the Oreana Private Wealth, myself and Matthew Jones are the Senior Wealth Advisors here. We are both dual licensed in Hong Kong and Australia to provide financial and strategic advice. Again, happy to have a chat with you regarding your own financial goals, and obviously making the best of being overseas and meeting your financial goals here and what that looks like when you do return to Australia ultimately. So we are very well placed to advise you on those matters. Outside of the strategic advice, Oreana also has its own investment capabilities that might or might not be something that you consider, but at the very least, please have a chat with us, and we'll be very happy to meet with you and just see if there's anything we can assist you with. So in terms of today's contents, if you like, so the main I guess point is with regards to the Australian federal budget, which was announced a couple of days ago. As you can understand, it's for the last few years anyway, it's been a very challenging time to be either a government or reserve bank, right? There has been a lot of changes in the world and a lot of challenges that I'll go through. And it's probably an interesting time, if that's the word to use, to see how the Australian government has positioned itself for the next few years to navigate this volatile times. Not forgetting that being overseas, being an Australian overseas, it puts you in a very advantageous position, really, when it comes to building and creating wealth. We look at some of the strategies that you can employ, especially if you still have assets back in Australia, such as investment property or superannuation probably, and some of the things that you can actually consider. We'll end the webinar with some time to answer any question that might have come up throughout the session. So feel free to just shoot off any questions you have in the Q&A Q&A box, I should say, and I'll try to attend to them as best as I can. So really, first up is about the federal budget, right? In terms of the federal budget itself, like any budgets, like any financial year, what the government does is, whoever is in power would try to, have their own picture of what's happening in the world as a starting background, if you like. It's, as I've mentioned before, it has been a challenging few years. And the challenges come thick and fast, right? Not only are we still trying to grapple with the end of COVID, there is and all the economic impact coming out of that, such as inflation, supply chain issues, and the like, and then not to mention the war that's happening in Europe. So all this really jumbles up the picture from an economic standpoint, and what the government needs to do to try to navigate Australia out of these waters, if you like. Not to mention things such as the US-China political divergence. So there has been a lot of challenges that has gone through. And so what the government needed to do was to take stock of all these things and form their own view, if you like, of what the next year would look like in light of all these different issues that's come to the fore. So what they're, I guess, from their standpoint, what they're seeing is, their view of the economy looks something like this. You have, they're looking at, an economic growth that will slow in the next 12 to 24 months. The next 23-24 year is projected to slow down to 1.5% from 3.25%. The unemployment rate will increase from 3.5% to 4.25% in the next financial year. So, looking at these numbers, it looks quite timid, right? It looks quite, a growth of 1.5% is nothing to write home about. But if you compare it to the other economies, the fact they're optimistic, and the fact that there will be some positive growth is putting them in the more the optimist bracket, if you like, compared to the other Western countries who have either marked more, no growth or even negative growth. So, this is more of a glass half full type of position from the government. Same with unemployment. Economics would suggest that anything below 5% is still, is a pretty good result for an economy. But then you look at things such as inflation, which then makes the picture more complex. So from the wage perspective, there is going to be an uptick in terms of wage growth from 3.75% to 4%, which does reflect more inflationary pressures, if you like, in terms of supply chain employment being more valuable, if you like, more scarce. Inflation is the big one, right? At the moment, it's running quite extremely high, really, at 6%. The government is, again, putting an optimistic view that it'll actually go down to 3.25%. So, hopefully there'll be quite a slowdown from an inflation perspective. The budget surplus is not a surprising one, but it's one of the ones that's, quite positive, in which for the next financial year, we're looking at a surplus of 4.2 billion. However, it's only temporary in nature, because it's going to probably blow out again as a deficit up to 13.9 billion next financial year. So this is the type of picture, looking at it from a holistic perspective. This, even though the numbers probably look quite somber, if you like, from a government perspective, it is quite positive, right? There is still going to be economic growth. Unemployment rate will still be quite acceptable, less than 5%. Yes, there will be supply, there will be inflationary pressures from wage growth and inflation perspective. But then there will be a budget surplus this year, something that hasn't happened for the last 15 years. However, we are going to move to a deficit in the next financial year. So just to summarize, we are looking at a weak global growth for the next 2 years. For those of us, well, all of us that have experienced the last few years anyway, I don't think that's too much of a surprise, I'm afraid. Volatility is here to stay. One of the reasons why we do have a temporary budget surplus is because of the commodity prices. As you know, Australia, the lucky country and all that, we are very strongly positioned when it comes to resources. And so the prices and the increase in those subsequent increase in those prices because of those supply chain issues due to COVID has actually increased the government's coffers significantly, hence arriving at a budget surplus, albeit temporarily. Not to mention that the RBA is really in the midst of fighting the biggest inflation challenge since the 1990s. It's probably not a good time to be an RBA governor because it's in one of those damn if you do, damn if you don't type of situation. They have to try to balance out the issue that inflation needs to be controlled, but it can't be in such a way that it causes a significant recession, right, or a downturn in economic activity. So it's quite a very a challenging juggling act, if you like, by the RBA to be able to try to manage rates. As recently they've been increasing it because of their view of inflationary pressure still persisting, but not to a point in which they really there'll be a spike downwards of economic activity, and we land in a recessionary type of environment, which nobody wants. So these are the type of I guess challenges that the government and the RBA is looking at. So coming into the federal budget, a lot of the focus has been put into measures that's needed to support the most vulnerable. I won't go into too much details, but because again, this presentation is supposed to be more from an expatriate lens, if you like, but it's important for us to know on highlights anyway, what the highlights are of those budgets. So the key measures are really in terms of the cost of living relief. So the government has put a lot of focus into this, as you know, because of the energy bills, etc. Those in the lower to middle income bracket has suffered. So there's been a $14.6 billion package to help those most affected. One of the examples is that for those eligible next financial year, they'll receive a $500 rebate for their energy bills. It won't go into their pocket, but it'll reduce the actual bill that they receive. There's also other examples such as, there'll be an increase in income support payments for those seeking employment of $40 a fortnight, and there's a 15% increase in rental assistance for those that are renting, if you like. So those are the type of measures they're trying to put in to make sure that living expenses are still being maintained, especially those in the lower income brackets. For those business owners in Australia, very quickly, there's been a push for the government to support them in acquiring more energy efficient or green energy type of investments. So there are concessions for businesses that are trying to do so as well. So taxation and super are the two things that I will be focusing a bit more, because it's probably a bit more relevant for us expatriates. So I'll actually now attend to the taxation. Now, not technically part of the budget, but the fact that the Labour government has been silent on this means that as of 1 July 2024, as scheduled, the personal income tax rate will be changed, right? Where on the left-hand side, you can see that in 2023, 2024, there are several brackets there. Just going through that particular brackets, there's 1, 2, 3 brackets with a 19%, 32.5%, 37%, 45% brackets. That's going to be more streamlined starting 1 July 2024, in which between 45,000 and 200,000 now, you'll be getting the 30% treatment. This is different to what it was previously, where it's only up to 120,000, right? And then anything over 200,000 will be getting the 45% treatment. So they're getting rid of the 37% treatment altogether. So what does this mean, Andre, from 1 July 2024? It means that those of you that are in a higher income tax bracket in Australia, right, will actually be saving, potentially, quite handsome amounts of tax. I did a calculation last night just to have a look at what this really means. So if you earn, say, 100,000, compared to what you're earning now in 2024, you stand to receive a tax cut saving of up to $1,500. If you earn 160,000 compared to now, in 1 July 2024, you stand to receive nearly $5,000 worth of tax cuts. So you will be paying $5,000 less in tax. And obviously going up the bracket, if you earn 200,000, the tax cut then becomes, up to $9,000. So, for those of you that are looking at returning back to Australia, that's going to be the type of environment that you'll be going into, which is, quite good compared to what it is currently. So this means that, for your Australian-based assets anyway, there is going to be, more tax room for tax liability, if you like, or a reduced tax rate. For those of us that are overseas, this also means that from 1 July 2024, this streamlining of tax bracket affects us as well. So for those of you that has income in Australia, from 0 to 200,000, it's 30%. Then from 200,000 and above, it's 45%. So again, putting that into play, if you earn 150,000 this year as a non-resident, you're paying around 49,000. If you earn the same amount on 1 July 2024, you'll be paying around 45,000. So there's a bit of a tax saving there. What does this mean in terms of your planning? Well, it depends on, I guess, the type of assets that you have and where it's placed. If it's placed in Australia, then obviously this is going to be something quite welcome, especially if you are returning back to Australia, because this really does shift the mark, if you like, in terms of the tax advantages, probably benefiting more on the upper end of the scale, which I'm putting probably a blanket statement here, but those of us overseas returning to Australia would probably be returning to those type of rates. In terms of superannuation, one of the things that they have done is that, for those of you that have super balances over $3 million, which is quite a lot, in terms of $3 million. So the actual people that have $3 million over, those that have balances over 3 million, it's not that many. There's around 13 or 15,000 taxpayers. But nevertheless, if you do have those type of balances, that, the concessional treatment of superannuation reduces, where previously you are only taxed at up to 15%. Any income, any growth of your funds, if you have balances over 3 million, will now be taxed at 30%. So it's probably less of an attraction for people that have those type of balances to invest in superannuation. They've aligned the timing of SG payments. You know how back in Australia, right, when you get your pay packet, you also get SG payments, which is paid quarterly currently. Now what they're doing is making sure that if you're paid monthly, then your SG needs to come in monthly. If you're paid fortnightly, your SG needs to come in fortnightly, which means from an average perspective, the payments into your super will actually be more regular, which is a good thing as well. Last year, what they've done, right, for people that wants to preserve monies in their super, if they've started an income stream in their super, the government has halved the amount of the minimum pension that you can actually receive. But that was supposed to stop on the 1st of July 2023, which means that there's no extension, meaning that come to the next financial year, the minimum amount of pension that you have to take out of your income stream will now be the normal. It won't be the half the amount that they did the last financial year. This really just applies more to people that have started a superannuation pension out of their superannuation fund. I'd like to also remind you of the recent changes in superannuation, right? Because there has been a lot of work put into that area, which makes superannuation more attractive, if not already, in terms of being your retirement, your sole retirement fund, your sole income stream in retirement. So what already is in place is that now, where previously you need to meet a work test of some sort, you need to be working over a certain age if you want to still continue to contribute into super past the age of 65, for instance. Now that work test has been removed. If you want to put in significant funds amount, where currently you can put 300,000 in a 3-year period, right? But you can only be, previously you can only be up to 65. Now you can be up to 75, which really increases or extends the window for those of you wanting to put lump sums in. In Australia, if you have sold your house and you want to put in funds into super in an effective manner, that also is allowed, and they have reduced the eligibility age, which means that you can do this sooner. You don't have to wait till 65. You can do this when you're 60. So in summary, there's been a lot of work to be done to make superannuation more accessible for more people on different age groups. If nothing else out of this seminar, if you don't remember anything else I say, review your superannuation will probably be one of the main things that I'd like you to remember. So the takeaway really from Australian expat is not that much. Hopefully I've given you a bit of a grasp in terms of what the government was trying to do in terms of helping those that's most needed, trying to juggle a lot of different things and the RBA trying to manage the interest rates, making sure that we don't really go through a deep recession going forward. So the takeaway really is the economy is expected to slow sharply. Now, how does that really impact us here? So for those of you that have Australian-based assets, say Australian equities, Australian bonds, those type of things, you might want to then recalibrate your expectation in terms of the returns, right? Because once the economy is obviously going to slow sharply, that will have impact in terms of economic activity, when we have impact in terms of company performing, etc. And so if you have Australian equities, that will be something that they might have an effect really. So you probably need to then recalibrate or have manage your expectation, if you like, in terms of the returns coming from your Australian-based assets. Better tax rates for your Australian-based income assets. So if you are returning back to Australia, what the Schedule 3 changes, it's called, or Stage 3 changes, it's called, will mean that you will probably be paid less tax when you're going back to Australia. It'll still be quite significant compared to the rest of the OECD countries, but it's much better than what it is currently. There's no word on any changes in residency rules, right? So one of the things that there was a hot topic the last 12 to 18 months was the government at that time was considering whether to change the residency rules for expatriates. How is this significant? Is because with Australia, right, being a very taxed country, if I can put it that way, being a resident and being a non-resident makes a big difference in terms of tax. So the point of when you become an Australian tax resident and the circumstances around it was quite important. One of the things they were looking at is, for instance, where currently you can spend 183 days without without it affecting your residency. One of the proposed rules was that if you spend up to 45 days in Australia and meet some particular rules, if you like, then potentially for that financial year, because you spend 45 days in Australia, you can be a resident, meaning that your taxable income, the ATO would be very interested of what you've done. Having said that, there hasn't been any word of any changes or any review or any update on that. So it looks like it's now in the back burner for now, as understandably the government has other priorities to tackle. But we'll obviously keep you up to date of any changes in that respect. I've probably mentioned this a few times now, but please review your super. Notwithstanding that you are overseas, superannuation in Australia remains extremely attractive when it comes to your retirement planning. Even if you don't plan to retire in Australia, right? Superannuation in Australia has no jurisdictional issues. You can contribute into super when you're overseas. You can receive income from your super when you are overseas. And because of the tax rates that's in play, 15% when you're building your super and 0 when you start an income stream, right? Imagine that, a 0 tax structure in Australia, right? So it becomes something that you really need to seriously consider, especially if retirement planning is one of your priorities, and we can help you with that. So that really, in a nutshell, is when it comes to the recent federal budget anyway, what are the things that might be, that might affect us here overseas. So what I'd like to do now really is just go through some key considerations or other strategies that you might consider, especially if you have property in Australia. So one of the things, if you do have property in Australia, is to understand your tax residency. And I probably have quickly noted that because depending on whether you're a resident or a non-resident, there will be impact, especially if you have Australian property and what you plan to do with it. One of the biggest tips really is that to avoid selling your Australian property while you are a non-resident, right? If you establish you're a non-resident and you're looking to sell your Australian property, we suggest that you probably wait a while until you are an Australian resident. The reason for that is because if you are a non-resident and so you sell your Australian property, capital gains is something that you need to then be liable for, where previously, if you have a principal residence, for instance, there's no capital gains. That's no longer the case if you're non-resident. So please be careful when you are considering whether you want to sell your residency, your investment property or your principal property in Australia. There's this 6-year rule currently, right? So if you're an Australian resident, you have a principal home and you decide to rent that principal home out without actually having any other properties to speak of, you can actually, still treat that as your principal residence and have no capital gains to pay for a 6-year window, right? But after that 6-year window, then you'd need to either move back to that property to restart that arrangement or sell that property without capital gains. Again, that only happens, or that's only allowed if you are an Australian resident. If you are an Australian non-resident, that rule doesn't apply. So you need to actually just make sure you understand that if you are looking at changes to your Australian property. The 50% CGT discount applies for any assets that you hold for 12 months in Australia. And again, that is something that only residents can benefit from. Non-residents doesn't receive this particular concession. Hence, our counsel that if you are selling your Australian property, wait until the time where you become an Australian resident again. If you have investment properties, make sure that you maximize your deductions, because remember, the rental income is still a taxable item for you, even though you're non-resident. Any type of deductions will be able to reduce that taxable income level. And you can obviously carry forward tax losses if you do have one previously. And as a non-resident, you can carry that forward as part of your tax arrangements. So just to summarize, if you're an Australian tax resident, if you're selling your home, the capital gains is fully exempt. If you're selling your investment property, it's discounted 50%, but anything after the 50% discount is included in your tax return for that year. Rental income is assessable for that income for that tax year as well. If you're a non-resident, on the other hand, if you're selling your home, 100% of your capital gains will be taxed at non-resident rates, which is quite, especially if you had that home for quite some time, notwithstanding the property sector volatility, I'm pretty sure there'll be some capital gains to speak of if you had a principal home in Australia. Same with your investment property. All of them are actually taxed at the non-resident rate, which means that, it's taxed at 30% really, right? It's because there is none of that tax-free threshold for us non-residents. And rental income is assessable income at non-resident rates. There are ways to assuage this or manage that, which I'll actually go through in the next slide. So I've spoken about property and what the issue is there in terms of selling properties. Now I'll turn my attention to superannuation for expatriates. Now, as I mentioned, superannuation, regardless of you not being in Australia, is a very attractive platform, if you like, for your retirement. Not only because of its overall tax structure, but you can actually do quite some interesting things to reduce your Australian tax income issue. Let me explain. Say, for instance, you have a rental property in Australia and you're renting out for 20,000 and then you have to currently pay tax on that 20,000 on non-resident tax rate, right? So you pay 30% on that. If you decide to make a contribution into super for 20,000 as well, and claim that as a tax deduction, that will then negate that rental income in its entirety. So rental income 20,000 less deduction of 20,000 means that you got zero taxable income for that year. Yes, that 20,000 comes into a superannuation environment, which is preserved, but at the very least, you don't lose that, and it's going to add into your retirement planning funds. So it's actually something that superannuation is something that can be very beneficial from a tax perspective as well. From a non-concession, so if you're not looking at tax benefit, a quick tax fix, if you like, from super, you can still put lumpy contributions into super, because remember, the end game for superannuation in Australia is the fact that you can start an income stream on a regular basis, regardless of where you are, and the capital is taxed at 0%, and the income from an Australian tax perspective is taxed at 0% as well. So it's an extremely tax-effective structure to hold your retirement assets. Yes, the funds will be preserved until you retire at age 60 at the earliest. But, if you think about it from a retirement savings perspective, that's what you want, right? You want to have a fund which actually is preserved and you can't touch until you need it in retirement. So super, if nothing else from this webinar, right, guys, review your superannuation, talk to us about what your current position is and how you can actually optimize that as part of your retirement planning funds. Still on, I guess, long-term investments outside superannuation, there are other solutions that can be that you can benefit from. There are solutions such as portfolio bonds, which is a wrapper, if you like. Say, for instance, you have an investment and then you wrap it in this particular structure. As long as you meet the contribution rules, and that's something that we can go through in our chat if this is something you're looking at, and you hold the investment for 10 years, regardless of where you are, regardless of whether you're still overseas or you're back in Australia, any capital gains within that 10 years will be tax-free, right? So that investment itself, right, it can continue investing in whatever the investments are. It's liquid in nature. You can still get access to a point for it. But if you held it for 10 years and you meet that contribution rule, any capital gains within that period, right, that 10-year period will be tax-free. That's something that you can have a look at. So very similar to superannuation, but it's probably a bit more accessible. And then you have foreign superannuation as well. For those of you that have significant assets overseas and you want to consolidate in an open architecture, what open architecture basically means is that you can actually just put your investment property in Bali, for instance, right, in this foreign super type of mechanism, and it can be seen as a somewhat a quasi superannuation fund, right? We can start withdrawing from the ages 55, where super is 60, and it can be rolled over to an Australian super if need be. So these are the type of solutions that outside of superannuation Australia that we can actually benefit from as an Australian expatriate overseas. Most of these two anyway are subject to private ATO rulings, which means that the ATO has confirmed or needs to confirm that they retain their tax effective status going forward. It has so far, and we believe it will be going forward as well. So in terms of the content today anyway, that really is it for me. Thank you so much for your patience. I've gone through a lot, right? We've gone through the federal budget. How is it relevant to the expat community? Things to take out of that is, Australia is probably going to enter a more tax-friendly environment going forward after 1 July 2024. Superannuation remains something that's very lucrative if you're looking at retirement funds. And there are a few things in terms of property that you need to have a look at. So I'll go through some questions that's gone through, just see how that, if I can attend them in the time that I have. Hi, Hunter. Just very quickly, yes, happy to share the slides. It will actually be sent to you as an attendee, along with a recording of the presentation. Okay, there's a question here. Can I contribute an excess into super even though I'm overseas? Absolutely. As I've mentioned, with superannuation, you can contribute into super and even benefit from tax benefits if you have assets to Australia to offset income against. So it's a live option for those of you overseas. And even if you decide to retire overseas, superannuation in Australia is something that you need to really review because of that nil tax consideration. Another question here is, how should you invest in these volatile times? Is cash safer? That's a very good question, right? I mean, it's very easy to look at the headlines of, equity tanking, are we in a recession, bonds, property all falling in terms of valuation. What's important for me and Matt really is to understand what your goals are ultimately. What, in terms of your financial position, your financial objectives, working overseas, what's the end play for you? What are you looking to achieve? That probably is probably a better starting point in the discussion as opposed to what to invest. In terms of cash, yes, it might be safer. There's good, if you go to HSBC or whatever it is, they are probably providing you with really good interest rates at the moment. Will that last? I don't know, because remember, cash would have that, the purchasing power of cash also will recede during times of inflation. So cash itself, yes, it'll give you a 3 or 4% return probably, but remember the purchasing power itself would reduce because of, inflation. Then, looking at other assets, yes, equities is probably very volatile, but if you're looking at investing for 10, 15-year investment window, then maybe it's probably not out of the question. So in terms of looking at your financial position, look at what you'd like to achieve, and then we can start from there. There are other questions here. What to do if we have rental income and how to reduce tax using super? Yes, I think I've gone through that a little bit very quickly just then during the presentation. So if you have, say, a rental income of 20,000 and you contribute into super and claim that contribution of 20,000 as well into super as a tax deduction, you've basically negated it. So it's quite effective, right? In terms of rental income, of being able to reduce tax using superannuation. Hopefully that answers that. Just click on this. And then here, another one here is, given high mortgage rates, would you recommend a lump sum payment to the mortgage, or is super account as a better option? I mean, that's a very good question, and we get this question a lot. So the question is, if you have 20,000, do you reduce your mortgage, right? Depending on, or do you actually put into superannuation? So it looks at the first point of departure is probably the rates. What are you paying in terms of your mortgage rates, right? What is your financial objectives for the 20,000? Is it to increase funds in retirement, or is it to increase your equity in your house at the moment? So again, not throwing the question back to you, or it really is coming back to what your financial priorities are. Both are really good options. If it's more of a cash flow play, I would put it into your mortgage, because that obviously reduces the repayment as well as increases the equity of your home. But if your cash flow is quite good and you are behind in, say, the amount that you'd like to have in your superannuation, and depending on what your age as well is, maybe superannuation is a better option as well. So it really comes down to what you'd like to achieve. Okay. Are there financial products worth investing in Hong Kong that is not available in Australia? That's a very good question. There are a lot, as you could imagine, Hong Kong being a hub of the financial markets. There are really a lot of weird and wonderful things that you can do outside Australia. But remember, one of the reasons why, that's not a blasé response, if you like, but if you are investing in Australia, you're entering a very strict, very regulated environment, which means that there are very strict requirements in terms of financial products that are available in Australia. For those that are more high net worth or more institutional in nature, there might be quite good investments that you can have a look at that you can't get in Australia. And there's somebody they're happy to have that conversation with you. But the answer is absolutely. Depending on the type of risk, type of volatility that you need, and the amounts, there are investments in Hong Kong that you can't necessarily get in Australia, especially that, I guess, that global scope as well in terms of the markets. So that just a few increases here. Here's our superannuation returns taxed at marginal rates if you are below 60 or of age, or can it just be the withholding tax rate of 10%? Good question. If you invest in superannuation, you're basically in superannuation is a platform, if you like. If you like, imagine superannuation as an empty box, right? Any investments that you chuck into that box will have hopefully returns, capital or income. That capital income is only going to be taxed at 15%. Right? It's not going to be taxed in your tax returns. It's only going to be taxed within superannuation. So it happens automatically. So there's a bit of a partition, right? That empty box, if it then becomes, if you are ready to retire, it then swings into what's called the pension phase, the pension box, and there's no tax, right? But once it's in that accumulation box, it's only taxed at 15%, right? So it doesn't really impact your marginal tax rate outside super. It's actually superannuation is internally taxed, right? So to your question, are superannuation returns taxed at marginal rates? No. And if you are below 60, or can it be just the withholding rates? It's actually just that rate at 15% at the most when you are accumulating. Another one here, never lived in Australia, never had income in Australia, thus no superannuation fund. May want to retire in Australia. What to do? Absolutely, no issues there. You can definitely build. The only thing is that, you need to have a tax file number, an Australian tax file number to start an Australian superannuation fund. So that's probably something you need to attend to. I mean, Australia is a great place to retire. I plan to do that. Don't talk to my missus though, but I'd like to return to Australia and retire there because it's great, right? Yes, it's a tax environment, but again, with the right strategies, there's definitely the opportunity to retire there in tax-effective manner, especially with Australia. But to your question, you can superannuation has no jurisdictional issues as long as you meet the fund requirement, which is to have a tax file number. I think then you can start building retirement income in Australia or in an Australian fund. Just going through some questions. I'm glad that there's quite a few questions here. Just a few more, and I thank you for your patience. Can I contribute and access into super even though I'm overseas? Yes, I think I've answered that one, which is absolutely. Just going through with, okay, what's the goal with this? An interesting one. What's the goal with receiving Australian age pension when you live overseas? So the idea is, if you are 67 currently, you can get an Australian age pension. You obviously have to return to Australia and prove that you've been there for 10 years at some stage, right? And you'll be eligible for the age pension, right? That's all fine. However, if you then decide to then go back overseas for more than 26 weeks, then the age pension your Australian age pension will come under scrutiny. So they would say, okay, if Andre has received age pension at age 67, he then moves overseas for more than 26 weeks and still receiving the age pension, we will look at whether Andre has actually spent his working life for at least 35 years in Australia. If he has done so, then he can still receive the age pension as I understand it. If he hasn't, say for instance, he's only been in Australia for like 20 years of his working, his Australian age pension will be proportionally reduced. So yes, you can still receive the age pension and live overseas, right? Obviously you need to go back first to receive it. But then it becomes a bit proportional depending on how, in terms of your working life, how long you've actually been in Australia. There's also a bit of from Adrian Law, hi mate, just a confirmation that the downsizer age, so that idea of selling your house and putting funds into superannuation is now 55, not 60. And the non-concessional cap is 330,000 if you want to bring that forward. So thank you, Adrian, for that confirmation. Okay, I think I've answered everything. So again, thank you so much for your attendance. I know there's not too much when it comes to the federal budget itself for expatriates, but there's a few watch this space if you hopefully that I've presented, especially with the the circumstances that we have. Make no mistake, being overseas and actually creating wealth from an Australian tax perspective is very advantageous. So it's something that you definitely need to take advantage of. And that's what me and Matt are here to do. So, I'll close this presentation. Thank you so much for your attendance. You will receive this presentation as part of our reach out going forward. And Matt and I potentially will also say good day as well, be that email or a phone. But please keep in touch, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next webinar. Thank you.